Look, I have the documents on my phone. I can show you right
reach
here.
for anything! Turn around!
Hands behind your back. Now! This is insane. This is my home. You're being detained.
The call crackled through the dispatch radio at 11:52 a.m., a sliver of digital noise slicing through the mundane quiet of a Wednesday patrol. For Officer Cade Jennings, it was the sound of opportunity. At 36, with 8 years on the force, Jennings still felt the constant, nagging pressure to distinguish himself. He wasn't content to just write traffic tickets and respond to domestic disputes. He wanted the big arrests, the ones that got you noticed, the ones that led to a detective's shield. The report was for a stolen commercial van, a white Ford Transit, taken from a construction site less than a mile from his current position. The GPS tracker had given one final ping 10 minutes ago before going dark, placing it somewhere in the vicinity of the idyllic tree-lined streets of the Northwood Hills subdivision. It was a neighborhood of manicured lawns, two-car garages, and an almost unnerving sense of suburban peace. It was the last place you'd expect to find a stolen work vehicle. For Jennings, that discrepancy was exactly what made it interesting. Criminals were getting bolder, he thought, using quiet neighborhoods like this as cooling-off spots to stash stolen property before moving it or stripping it for parts. He navigated his patrol car through the curving streets, his eyes scanning driveways and curbsides. His partner for the day, Officer Amelia Rourke, a calm and observant woman with 3 years on the job, was quietly cross-referencing the last known GPS coordinates on her tablet. The signal died somewhere in a 100-yard radius of Elm Street and Oak Ridge Drive, she said, her voice even. Could be in a driveway, could be tucked behind a house. Jennings grunted in acknowledgement, his focus absolute. He had a theory, a narrative that was already forming in his mind. The thief wasn't a professional. A pro would have disabled the GPS immediately. This was an amateur, someone who got lucky and was now in over their head. As he turned onto Oak Ridge Drive, he saw it. Parked in the driveway of a modest but impeccably maintained 2-story colonial was a white Ford Transit. It wasn't an exact match. The report mentioned a specific company logo and this one was blank, but it was close enough. It was too close to be a coincidence. A jolt of adrenaline, sharp and clean, coursed through him. This was it. There, he said, pointing. 1425 Oak Ridge. That's gotta be it. Rourke looked up from her tablet, a slight frown creasing her brow. Cade, the report specified Valenti Construction on the side. This one's clean. Jennings dismissed her caution with a wave of his hand. First thing they do is peel the decals. It's the right model, the right color, in the right area. What are the odds? He had already made up his mind. Every piece of information from this point forward would be filtered through the lens of that conclusion. He pulled the patrol car to the curb about 50 feet from the house, killing the engine. The silence that followed was heavy with anticipation. The house itself looked normal. A freshly cut lawn, a neatly trimmed hedge, and a child's bicycle, now too small for any rider, leaning against the garage. A brand-new BMW sedan was parked next to the van, gleaming in the late morning sun. A reasonable officer might have paused, considering that the scene didn't fit the profile of a stolen vehicle chop shop. But to Jennings, these were just props, a clever facade. He saw the expensive car and thought not of a successful homeowner, but of a criminal with expensive taste. He saw the quiet street and thought not of a peaceful community, but of the perfect cover. "Let's go," he said, his hand already resting on the butt of his service weapon. He didn't wait for Rourke. He swung his door open, the decisive thud echoing in the quiet air. He was a man on a mission, fueled by a potent cocktail of ambition and assumption. He didn't run the plates on the BMW. He didn't check property records to see who owned the home. He didn't consider the possibility that this was all just a massive, statistically improbable coincidence. In his mind, the man inside that house was a car thief, and he was about to make the arrest that would put him one step closer to that detective's shield. The body camera on his chest was rolling, its unblinking eye ready to capture a version of events that Jennings was already certain he understood. He walked up the pristine concrete pathway, his steps purposeful, his mind a closed loop of self-fulfilling prophecy. What he didn't know was that he was about to dismantle a man's life, and in the process, set fire to his own career. He raised his fist and knocked on the door, a series of sharp, authoritative raps that sounded less like a request and more like a demand. The mistake had already been made. The only thing left was for the consequences to unfold. The door opened after a few moments to reveal a man in his late 30s. He was tall and lean, with a thoughtful face and tired eyes. He wore a simple gray t-shirt smudged with a bit of dust and a pair of jeans. His name was Julian Hayes, and he was an architect who, just 48 hours earlier, had closed on this house, the first he had ever owned. He had spent the last 2 days in a whirlwind of unpacking boxes, directing movers, and trying to figure out which of the dozen identical keys on his new ring opened the back gate. He was exhausted, but it was the triumphant exhaustion of a dream realized. Seeing 2 police officers on his brand-new front porch was a jarring intrusion into his newfound domestic bliss. "Good morning, officers. Can I help you?" Julian's voice was calm, polite, and tinged with the slight weariness of someone who had been lifting furniture all day. He offered a small, welcoming smile, the kind one gives to an unexpected visitor. He assumed they were perhaps introducing themselves to the new neighbor, or responding to a minor issue nearby. The reality of their purpose was not yet even a distant possibility in his mind. Officer Jennings didn't return the smile. His stance was aggressive, his eyes cold and assessing. He bypassed any form of polite introduction. "We're investigating a stolen vehicle. We have reason to believe it's on this property," he stated, his tone flat and accusatory. He gestured sharply with his chin toward the white van in the driveway. "Is that your vehicle?" Julian's brow furrowed in confusion. He glanced back at the van, then back at the officer. "The van? Yes, it's mine. I just bought it from my firm. I'm starting my own architecture practice." He offered this information freely, believing a simple explanation would clear up any misunderstanding. This was the action of a man with absolutely nothing to hide. "I have the bill of sale right inside on the counter. I was just sorting through paperwork." But Jennings wasn't listening to the words. He was interpreting the scene through his pre-written script. A black man in a new, expensive neighborhood, a late-model luxury car, and a commercial van. To Jennings, the pieces didn't add up to new homeowner and aspiring business owner. They added up to suspect. He saw Julian's calm demeanor not as a sign of innocence, but as the practiced composure of a seasoned liar. "Your firm?" Jennings repeated the words with a note of incredulity, as if the concept itself were preposterous. "I'm going to need to see your identification, and the registration for that van." His voice was louder now, harder. The conversation was no longer a query, it was an interrogation. Officer Rourke shifted uncomfortably beside him. She could see the bewilderment on Julian's face, the genuine confusion of a man being accused of something incomprehensible. She saw the open boxes through the doorway, the clear signs of someone in the process of moving in. Her training told her to de-escalate, to gather facts, to listen. But Jennings was the senior officer. He was leading the call. "Of course," Julian said, though his welcoming smile had vanished, replaced by a guarded, concerned expression. "My wallet is just inside on the kitchen island. Can I—" He gestured toward the interior of his home. "Stay right where you are," Jennings commanded, taking a half-step forward, closing the distance between them. "Don't move." The command was unnecessarily aggressive, turning the front porch into a standoff. Julian froze, his hands slightly raised in a universal gesture of non-aggression. The shock was beginning to set in. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was something else entirely. He was being treated like a criminal at the threshold of his own home. "Look, officer, I think there's been a mistake," Julian said, his voice steady but firm. "I just bought this house. The van is mine. I can prove it. The deed to the house is in the same folder as the bill of sale for the van. Let me just get the paperwork." It was a perfectly reasonable request. an offer of complete transparency that would have ended the entire encounter in less than a minute. But Jennings had already traveled too far down the road of his own assumption to turn back. Admitting he might be wrong now would be a concession, a loss of control. He saw the offer of proof not as a gesture of cooperation, but as a stalling tactic. "We'll get to the paperwork," Jennings said dismissively. "First, I want to know what you're doing here. Who owns this house?" The question was a calculated provocation, designed to trip him up. But Julian answered plainly. "I do. My name is Julian Hayes. I closed on Monday. The previous owners were the Millers. You can call them if you need to." He was providing names, timelines, verifiable facts. Each sentence was a brick of truth, laid out to build a wall of reason against the officer's rising tide of suspicion. Jennings, however, seemed determined to knock that wall down. He ignored the offer to verify the information, his focus narrowing, his certainty hardening into a dangerous, immovable object. The collision was no longer just a possibility, it was happening, right there on the sun-drenched porch of 1425 Oak Ridge Drive. The request to get his own paperwork from his own kitchen was met with a stone wall of refusal. "We're not doing that right now," Jennings said, his voice leaving no room for argument. "I'm going to ask you to step outside, all the way out onto the lawn." Julian looked from Jennings's unyielding face to Officer Rourke, a silent appeal in his eyes. He was looking for a sign of reason, an acknowledgement of how absurd this was becoming. Rourke held his gaze for a fraction of a second, her expression troubled, but she remained silent, her hands clasped behind her back. Her deference to her senior partner created a vacuum where common sense should have been. Julian, seeing no alternative that wouldn't escalate the situation into a physical confrontation, complied. He stepped off the porch and onto the grass he had just mowed for the first time the day before, his hands kept visibly at his sides. "Okay, I'm outside," Julian said, his patience wearing thin but his voice still measured. "Now please, let's clear this up. I have the documents on my phone as well, the digital closing papers, the email from the dealership about the van. I can show you right now." He reached slowly for his back pocket where his phone was. "Don't reach for anything," Jennings barked, his hand moving instinctively to his sidearm. The movement was electric, transforming the quiet suburban lawn into a zone of potential violence. Julian's hand froze in midair. "I was just getting my phone," he said, the words coming out low and tight. "You asked for proof." "I'm trying to give it to you." "I'll tell you when I want to see something," Jennings snapped back. He was now fully committed to a script of his own making, a script in which Julian was a dangerous and deceptive criminal. Every cooperative action was reinterpreted as a trick. Every offer of evidence was seen as a diversion. He was no longer investigating a crime, he was trying to prove his initial assumption was correct, no matter how much reality contradicted it. This was the moment Rourke should have intervened decisively. She could have suggested running the plates on the BMW. She could have insisted on checking Julian's identification against property records. She could have simply said, "Cade, let's just look at the man's phone." But the culture of law enforcement, the unspoken hierarchy of a patrol car, kept her silent. Voicing dissent in the middle of a tense encounter could be seen as undermining her partner, a cardinal sin. And so she watched, her unease growing into a knot in her stomach, as Jennings made his next catastrophic error. "Turn around, place your hands behind your back," Jennings commanded. The words hung in the air, surreal and shocking. Julian stared at him, his mind struggling to process the command. "You're putting me in handcuffs? Why? I haven't done anything wrong. This is my property." "You're being detained for investigation of possession of a stolen vehicle," Jennings recited, the formal language a bizarre contrast to the injustice of the situation. "Turn around. Now." "This is insane," Julian said, shaking his head in disbelief. But he saw the look in Jennings's eyes. It was a look of absolute certainty, beyond the reach of reason or evidence. He knew that resisting would only lead to a charge of resisting arrest, adding a layer of manufactured guilt to his complete innocence. With a deep, shuddering sigh of frustration, he turned around, the feeling of the cool metal of the handcuffs closing around his wrists a sickening shock to his system. He was being arrested on his own front lawn, in full view of the neighbors who were now beginning to peer out of their windows, their curiosity piqued by the sight of a police car and a man being cuffed. "Cade," Rourke finally said, her voice quiet but urgent. "Maybe we should just verify the paperwork first. This feels fast." It was a gentle protest, too little and far too late. Jennings shot her a look that was pure ice. "I've got this, Rourke," he said, his voice low and laced with a clear warning. "The suspect matches the general description from a bolo last week. I'm not taking any chances." It was a lie, or at best a gross exaggeration. There was no specific description that matched Julian, but it was the justification Jennings needed, a flimsy shield for his pride. He didn't want to be second-guessed, especially not by his junior partner. He pulled Julian's wallet from his back pocket himself, flipping it open. He glanced at the driver's license. Julian Hayes, 1425 Oak Ridge Drive. The evidence was literally in his hand. The man's identification showed he lived at the very address where he was being arrested. It was irrefutable, undeniable proof that this was a terrible mistake. Jennings looked at the license, looked at the numbers on the front of the house, and then looked at Julian. A flicker of something, doubt perhaps, crossed his face for a nanosecond, but was instantly extinguished by the fire of his own ego. He couldn't back down now. He had already put the man in cuffs. Admitting the error would be a public humiliation, so he made the most damaging decision of all. He chose to ignore the truth. He closed the wallet and shoved it into his own pocket. To Rourke, he simply said, "His ID is probably fake. We'll sort it out at the station." The silence of the evidence was deafening, but Jennings refused to hear it. The ride to the station was a surreal 10-minute journey into a bureaucratic nightmare. Julian sat in the back of the patrol car, the hard plastic seat digging into his back, the cage a stark physical barrier between his world and theirs. He watched his own house, his sanctuary, recede in the rearview mirror. He saw his new BMW, his new work van, and the neighbor's curtains twitching. He had lived in his dream home for 2 days, and now he was being taken from it in handcuffs, branded a car thief by the very people meant to protect him. He remained silent, realizing that anything he said would be twisted or ignored. The time for explanations was over. The damage was being done, minute by agonizing minute. At the station, the absurdity of the situation began to announce itself through paperwork. Officer Jennings led a compliant, non-resistant Julian to the booking desk, overseen by Sergeant Frank McGregor, a 25-year veteran with a perpetually tired expression and an encyclopedic knowledge of departmental procedure. McGregor had seen every kind of criminal walk through these doors, from frantic shoplifters to cold-blooded killers. He also knew the look of a bad arrest. Jennings began his preliminary report with a confident, almost theatrical air, detailing his response to a suspected stolen vehicle and his detention of a non-compliant individual found at the scene. McGregor listened, his pen hovering over the intake form. "Okay, Cade," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Let's get his property cataloged. What's his name and address?" Jennings handed over Julian's wallet. "Says his name is Julian Hayes. The address on the ID is 1425 Oak Ridge Drive." He said it as if it were an irrelevant detail, part of the suspect's cover story. McGregor stopped writing. He looked down at the driver's license, then up at the address Jennings had just dictated for the arrest location. He blinked slowly as if to make sure he wasn't misreading. "Let me get this straight, Jennings," the sergeant said, his voice devoid of any emotion. "You arrested this man for stealing a van that was parked in the driveway of the address listed on his own driver's license." The question laid out so plainly exposed the utter illogicality of the arrest. Several other officers within earshot paused what they were doing, their attention drawn to the exchange. The air in the booking area grew thick with unspoken questions. Jennings, however, remained defiant. His pride was now a fortress, and he was defending it with everything he had. "The ID could be a high-quality forgery, Mac," he insisted, his voice a little too loud. "And he was uncooperative, refused to answer my questions directly. It's all consistent with a suspect trying to talk his way out of a corner." This was a blatant fabrication. Julian had been nothing but cooperative, but the official report would soon reflect Jennings's version of reality. McGregor stared at him for a long moment, his expression unreadable. He had seen this before. A younger officer, convinced of his own infallibility, painting himself into a corner and refusing to admit he was holding the wrong brush. "Right," McGregor said, the single word dripping with skepticism. He stamped the paperwork with a heavy, final-sounding thud. He knew this would be a mountain of trouble later, but Jennings was the arresting officer. It was his collar and his mess to clean up. Julian was led away to be fingerprinted and photographed. He stood against the height chart, the flash of the camera capturing the weary disbelief in his eyes. He felt a profound sense of detachment, as if he were watching a movie about someone else. This couldn't be his life. Meanwhile, back at 1425 Oak Ridge Drive, the seeds of Jennings's undoing were being sown. Carol Peterson, a retired history teacher who lived 2 houses down, had watched the entire scene unfold from her living room window. She had seen Julian moving in over the last couple of days and had been planning to bring him a welcome to the neighborhood pie. She saw him speak calmly to the officers. She saw him put in handcuffs. And she knew, with the certainty of a woman who had taught critical thinking for 40 years, that something was profoundly wrong. She didn't know the details, but she knew injustice when she saw it. She remembered meeting the previous homeowners, the Millers, at a block party. She still had their number in her old address book. Finding the book took her a few minutes, but she located the number and dialed, her fingers trembling slightly with indignation. Mark Miller answered on the 3rd ring. "Mark, it's Carol Peterson from Oak Ridge," she began, her voice rushed. "I'm so sorry to bother you, but something terrible is happening at your old house. The police have arrested the new owner. They put him in handcuffs and took him away." There was a stunned silence on the other end of the line. "What? Julian? That's impossible," Mark Miller said. "He's a wonderful man, an architect. Why on earth would they arrest him?" Carol explained what she had seen. Miller's shock quickly turned to anger. "This is outrageous. I'm calling the police station right now." The phone call, born from a neighbor's sense of decency, was a single, precise torpedo heading straight for the hull of Officer Cade Jennings's carefully constructed lie. The system had failed Julian Hayes, but a citizen was about to force it to look at itself in the mirror. The call from Mark Miller was routed through the station's main switchboard and, due to its unusual nature, was patched directly to the Detective Bureau. It was picked up by Detective David Miller, no relation to the caller, a 20-year veteran with a reputation for being methodical, fair, and utterly intolerant of shoddy police work. He listened patiently as the former homeowner, his voice a mixture of fury and disbelief, explained that the man who had just been arrested at 1425 Oak Ridge Drive was not a car thief, but the legitimate new owner of the property, a man to whom he had personally handed the keys 2 days prior. "He's an architect, for God's sake," Mark Miller said, his voice cracking with frustration. "Not a criminal. His name is Julian Hayes. Your officers arrested an innocent man in his own home." Detective Miller's internal alarms, honed by 2 decades of investigating real crimes, began to ring loudly. He thanked the caller, promising to look into the matter immediately. After hanging up, he walked out of his office and down to the booking desk, where Sergeant McGregor was still shaking his head over the paperwork. "Mac, give me the file on the stolen vehicle arrest from Oak Ridge, the one Jennings just brought in," Miller said. McGregor slid the flimsy folder across the counter without a word. Miller opened it. The red flags were not just present, they were practically waving in his face. He saw the arrest address matching the suspect's driver's license. He saw Jennings's flimsy, one-sentence justification for ignoring this fact. Suspect may be using forged identification. There was no mention of any attempt to verify the ID. He read Jennings's narrative, which painted Julian as evasive and uncooperative, a description that felt hollow and self-serving. Most damning of all, there was no actual evidence of a crime listed in the report, only Officer Jennings's suspicion. The van in the driveway had not been confirmed as stolen. Its VIN had not been run against any database. The entire arrest was built on the quicksand of one officer's gut feeling. Miller closed the folder, his jaw tight. This wasn't just a mistake, it was a willful dereliction of basic police procedure. He walked from the booking desk to the holding area, the file held tightly in his hand. He found Julian sitting on a cold metal bench in a small, sterile cell, staring at the concrete floor. He looked less like a criminal and more like a man who had been struck by lightning on a clear day. "Mr. Hayes?" Miller said, his voice calm and professional. It was the first time all day anyone had addressed Julian with a shred of respect. Julian looked up, his eyes wary. "I'm Detective Miller. I'd like to ask you a few questions about what happened today, if you're willing." Julian nodded slowly. He had nothing to lose. He recounted the events of the past hour, his voice low and steady, detailing every interaction with Officer Jennings. He explained his purchase of the house, his new business, the van, and his repeated ignored offers to provide proof of ownership. He didn't embellish or editorialize, he simply stated the facts, and their power lay in their unadorned truth. When he was finished, Miller asked, "You mentioned you have digital copies of the closing documents on your phone?" "Yes," Julian replied. "My phone is in a plastic bag with my wallet and keys." Miller retrieved the bag from the property clerk. He handed the phone to Julian. "Show me." With a few taps, Julian pulled up the file. There it was, a 40-page PDF document, the official closing disclosure for 1425 Oak Ridge Drive, with Julian Hayes listed as the buyer. He swiped to another screen and pulled up the bill of sale for the Ford Transit van from a local dealership, dated 3 days earlier. Then he opened his photo gallery, showing Detective Miller pictures he had taken just yesterday. Him, covered in sweat, smiling proudly on the front porch. A selfie with a tower of moving boxes in the living room. A shot of the van and his BMW parked side by side in the driveway, his first ever full driveway photo. Detective Miller looked at the overwhelming evidence on the small screen. He had seen enough. This wasn't a case of mistaken identity or a complex criminal scheme. It was a colossal failure. He handed the phone back to Julian. "Thank you, Mr. Hayes. Please wait here. I'm going to get this sorted out." Miller walked directly back to his office and made a call to dispatch. "I need a unit to check the construction site at 8th and Industrial. See if Valenti Construction filed a formal stolen vehicle report and get the full VIN for their missing Ford Transit." Then he called Officer Cade Jennings on his department-issued cell phone. "Jennings, Detective Miller, I need you in my office, now. We need to talk about your arrest on Oak Ridge." The tone in Miller's voice was unmistakable. It wasn't a request for a chat, it was a summons. Jennings, who was in the middle of writing his formal, highly embellished report, felt a knot of dread tighten in his stomach. The simple, clean arrest he had envisioned was starting to unravel, and he had a sinking feeling that he was the one getting tangled in the threads. When Officer Jennings walked into Detective Miller's office, the atmosphere was thick with tension. Miller was sitting behind his cluttered desk, the thin arrest file open in front of him. He didn't invite Jennings to sit. He simply gestured to the folder. "Walk me through this, Cade," he said, his voice dangerously quiet. "Tell me why you arrested a man for stealing a van that was parked in the driveway of a house he owns." Jennings launched into the defense he had been rehearsing in his head, a tapestry woven from half-truths and outright lies. "The vehicle matched the description of one reported stolen in the area, Detective. When I made contact, the suspect was evasive. He couldn't produce registration, and he fit the profile of a bolo from last week." Miller let him finish, his expression unchanging. "He couldn't produce registration because you refused his offer to go inside and get it. He wasn't evasive. My review of your bodycam's audio confirms he calmly offered to show you the deed to the house and the bill of sale for the van. and there is no bolo with a description that specifically matches Julian Hayes. I checked. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle in the small office. I also spoke with the man who sold him the house. He confirms the sale, and I've seen the closing documents on Mr. Hayes's phone. So I'm going to ask you again, why is that man in a holding cell? Jennings's face flushed. Every pillar of his justification had been systematically knocked down. He was cornered, exposed. For a rational person, this would have been the moment to admit the mistake, to take responsibility, to begin the process of damage control. But for Cade Jennings, admitting he was wrong felt like a bigger failure than the wrongful arrest itself. His pride, now wounded and lashing out, sent him deeper into the abyss of delusion. "It's a con," Jennings said, the words tumbling out, sounding desperate even to his own ears. "It has to be. He's a squatter, a professional. He must have somehow created these fake documents. Maybe he's running a crew, targeting vacant homes in upscale neighborhoods. The van is probably part of the operation. He tricked the previous owner somehow." Miller stared at him, his expression shifting from serious to utterly incredulous. He had expected a defense, however weak. He had not expected a descent into paranoid fantasy. "A squatter, with a brand new BMW registered in his name, parked in the driveway," Miller countered, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "A con man who, instead of fleeing, repeatedly offers to show the police the very documents that would prove his guilt. Does any of that make sense to you, Cade?" Before Jennings could answer, the phone on Miller's desk buzzed. He picked it up. It was dispatch. "Go ahead," Miller said, his eyes still locked on Jennings. He listened for a moment, a grim sense of finality settling on his face. "Understood. Thank you." He hung up the phone. "That was dispatch," he said, his voice now as cold and hard as steel. "A patrol unit just found the stolen Valenti construction van. It was abandoned in an alleyway 3 blocks from the construction site, exactly where a real car thief would have dumped it. The vehicle your suspect was arrested for possessing has no connection to any crime whatsoever." The final, objective truth had been delivered. There was no longer any gray area, no room for interpretation or suspicion. Jennings's entire case, flimsy as it was, had just evaporated into thin air. He stood there speechless, his conspiracy theories turning to ash in his mouth. He had arrested an innocent man, ignored irrefutable evidence, and lied to a superior officer, all in pursuit of a crime that never existed at that location. Miller's face was a mask of professional fury. He knew what this meant. The department was now facing a massive lawsuit, a public relations disaster, and a deep stain on its reputation. And it was all because one officer was too arrogant and too stubborn to perform the most basic functions of his job. "I want your supplemental report on my desk in 1 hour," Miller said, his voice leaving no room for negotiation. "And it better contain nothing but the absolute truth of what happened today. Every detail, every ignored offer of proof, every refusal to verify. You will document your own failure. Is that clear?" Jennings could only nod, the weight of his career collapsing on his shoulders. Miller stood up. "I'm ordering the immediate release of Mr. Hayes, and I'm initiating a formal internal affairs complaint." He walked to the door and paused, looking back at the younger officer. "You didn't just make a mistake, Jennings. You made a choice. You chose suspicion over evidence. You chose ego over duty. And now you're going to have to live with the consequences of that choice." The door clicked shut, leaving Jennings alone in the office, the silence ringing with the sound of his own downfall. Julian Hayes was released from the police station at 3:15 p.m., less than 4 hours after he had been arrested. He walked out of the front doors into the afternoon sun, clutching a plastic bag containing his wallet, keys, and phone. He felt numb, violated, and utterly disoriented. Detective Miller had offered a brief, formal apology on behalf of the department, but the words felt hollow, a flimsy bandage on a gaping wound. Julian didn't go home right away. He couldn't. The idea of returning to the place that was supposed to be his sanctuary, now tainted by the memory of his humiliation, was unbearable. He sat in his car in a nearby park for over an hour, the engine off, trying to process the violent whiplash of the day's events. The next morning, he made a phone call. Not to a friend or family member, he wasn't ready to tell them yet, but to a lawyer. He found the number for the top civil rights firm in the state and scheduled a consultation. 2 days later, he was sitting across a polished mahogany table from Michael Grant and Sarah Jenkins, two sharp, relentless attorneys who had made their careers holding police departments accountable. They listened intently as Julian recounted his story, their expressions growing more serious with each detail. When he finished, Grant leaned forward. "Mr. Hayes," he said, "what you've described is not just a mistake. It's a flagrant violation of your Fourth Amendment rights against unreasonable search and seizure. It's false arrest, and it appears to be a clear case of racial profiling." The firm filed a formal request for all evidence related to the arrest, specifically the body camera footage from both Officer Jennings and Officer Rourke. The department, already in full crisis mode and acting on the advice of the city's attorneys, released it without a fight. They knew a legal battle was coming, and the footage was going to be the prosecution's star witness. Watching the video was an excruciating experience for Julian, but for his lawyers, it was a gold mine. The unblinking eye of the camera had captured everything. It showed Julian's calm, cooperative demeanor from the very beginning. It recorded his polite and logical explanations. It documented his multiple offers to provide proof of ownership, the deed, the bill of sale, the digital documents. And it captured with chilling clarity Officer Jennings's escalating aggression, his dismissive tone, and his outright refusal to engage with the facts being presented to him. The most damning portion was the moment after Julian was in handcuffs. The camera recorded the conversation between the two officers. Rourke's hesitant voice could be heard, "Cade, maybe we should just verify," followed by Jennings's sharp, prideful retort, "I've got this, Rourke." Then came the moment when Jennings looked at Julian's license, the address clearly visible to the camera's lens, before callously dismissing it as a fake. The footage didn't just show a mistake. It documented a conscious, stubborn refusal to see the truth. "This is indefensible," Sarah Jenkins said after their third viewing of the footage. "He had the truth in his hand and he chose to ignore it. A jury will be horrified." Meanwhile, Detective Miller's internal affairs complaint had landed like a bomb within the department. An official investigation was launched immediately. Officer Cade Jennings was placed on administrative leave, stripped of his badge and service weapon pending the outcome. His career, for all intents and purposes, was over. He just didn't know it yet. The internal affairs investigators interviewed everyone involved. Officer Rourke's testimony was particularly damaging to Jennings. She recounted her growing unease during the encounter, her feeling that the situation was being needlessly escalated, and her partner's explicit rejection of her suggestion to verify Julian's story. She admitted she should have been more forceful, but her testimony painted a clear picture of Jennings as an officer blinded by tunnel vision and ego. Sergeant McGregor described Jennings's bizarre and nonsensical explanations at the booking desk, his insistence that a driver's license matching the arrest address was a forgery. Detective Miller provided a detailed account of his own investigation, culminating in Jennings's wild conspiracy theories about a professional squatter ring. The evidence against Jennings was overwhelming, and it came almost entirely from his fellow officers. The blue wall of silence had crumbled under the sheer weight of his incompetence. The police union provided Jennings with a lawyer, but even the most seasoned union attorney knew this case was a lost cause. The video was irrefutable. There were no mitigating circumstances, no split-second decisions made under duress. It was a slow-motion catastrophe of one man's making. The story inevitably leaked to the press. A local investigative reporter got a tip about a wrongful arrest in Northwood Hills and started digging. When the body camera footage was eventually released to the public through a Freedom of Information request, the story exploded. It became the lead story on the local news, then got picked up by national outlets. Julian Hayes, the quiet architect, was suddenly the face of a national conversation about policing and prejudice. His life had been irrevocably altered, his privacy shattered. The fight for justice had begun, but he was quickly learning that justice, even when it seems certain, comes at a tremendous personal cost. The 6 months that followed the arrest were a slow, grinding process of legal and administrative reckoning. For Cade Jennings, it was a descent into a personal and professional hell of his own creation. Suspended without pay, he found himself isolated and ostracized. Former colleagues who once clapped him on the back in the briefing room now avoided his calls. The bravado he had displayed on Julian's front lawn had evaporated, replaced by the quiet panic of a man watching his life unravel. The legal fees were astronomical, draining his family's savings. His wife, who had always viewed his job with a mixture of pride and fear, now looked at him with a weary disappointment that was worse than anger. The stress was a constant, corrosive presence in their home, and their marriage began to fracture under the strain. The police department's internal investigation concluded with a 50-page report that was a brutal indictment of his conduct. It found that Jennings had violated a half-dozen departmental policies, including rules on probable cause, de-escalation, and conduct unbecoming an officer. The report officially recommended his immediate termination. Simultaneously, the district attorney's office, facing immense public pressure and armed with the damning bodycam footage, convened a grand jury. Police officers are rarely indicted for on-duty actions, but this case was different. There was no ambiguity, no claim of self-defense. The evidence of malfeasance was so clear-cut that the grand jury returned an indictment in less than a day. Cade Jennings was charged with felony counts of false imprisonment and official misconduct. The news sent shockwaves through the local law enforcement community. The shield of qualified immunity was not going to protect him. Faced with a criminal trial he was almost certain to lose, and a departmental hearing that would undoubtedly result in his firing, Jennings finally bowed to the inevitable. His attorney negotiated a plea agreement with the prosecutor. Jennings agreed to plead guilty to 1 count of official misconduct, a misdemeanor. In exchange for avoiding prison time, he would receive 3 years of probation, and more importantly, he would permanently surrender his law enforcement certification, ensuring he could never work as a police officer in any capacity again. His 8-year career ended not with a commendation, but with a quiet, humiliating signature on a plea deal. 3 months after the criminal case was settled, the civil lawsuit reached its conclusion. The city's lawyers knew that taking the case to trial would be a disaster. The body cam footage alone would be enough to sway any jury, and Julian Hayes presented as the perfect, unimpeachable victim. They opted to settle. The city agreed to pay Julian Hayes a settlement of $3.5 million to resolve all claims. But Julian's lawyers, Michael Grant and Sarah Jenkins, had pushed for more than just money. The settlement included non-monetary terms that were, to Julian, just as important. The city agreed to overhaul its police training protocols, implementing a mandatory annual training program on implicit bias, de-escalation, and Fourth Amendment rights. They also agreed to reform the citizen complaint process, creating a new independent oversight board to review allegations of police misconduct. For Julian, the money was a means to an end, a way to rebuild. He sold the house on Oak Ridge Drive. The memory of what had happened there was too toxic. The sanctuary had been permanently desecrated. He used a portion of the settlement to start his architecture firm, pouring his energy into designing buildings rather than dwelling on his own deconstruction. He also established a charitable foundation dedicated to funding police reform initiatives and providing legal aid to victims of wrongful arrest. He had never asked to be an activist, but the experience had forged him into one. He found a new purpose in trying to fix the broken system that had so casually broken him. Cade Jennings's life became a quiet study in diminished expectations. He avoided a criminal record that included a felony, but his conviction for misconduct made finding meaningful employment nearly impossible. He took a job working security for a warehouse on the night shift, a solitary existence that was a far cry from the authority and respect he had once commanded. His divorce was finalized a year after the settlement. He saw his children on weekends, trying to explain a world in which their father, once a figure of strength, had made a mistake so profound it had cost him everything. The ambition that had once burned so brightly within him was gone, leaving only the cold ash of regret. He was no longer a symbol of authority, but a cautionary tale told in police academy classrooms, a story of how quickly a career, a reputation, and a life can be undone, not by a single bullet, but by a single, stubborn refusal to see the truth. So, what really happened here? At its core, this story is a chilling illustration of how implicit bias, when combined with institutional power and personal ego, can become a truly destructive force. Officer Jennings's actions didn't stem from a single conscious decision to be malicious. They originated from a deeper, more insidious place. In his mind, the narrative was pre-written. The quiet, wealthy neighborhood was the wrong place for a black man with a commercial van to be. This subconscious stereotype created a filter through which he viewed every subsequent action. Julian's calm explanation wasn't seen as cooperation, but as deception. His offer to provide paperwork wasn't a sign of innocence, but a stalling tactic. This is the danger of confirmation bias. When you're only looking for evidence that proves your theory, you become blind to all evidence that refutes it. Jennings's ambition and ego were the accelerants on this fire. He didn't want to be the cop who responded to a false alarm. He wanted to be the hero who cracked a clever car theft ring. Backing down from his initial assumption would have felt like a personal failure in front of his junior partner, and that fear of looking weak overrode his sworn duty to be objective. Could Julian have done anything differently to protect himself? It's a heartbreaking question because the answer is almost certainly no. If he had been more agitated, he would have been labeled as aggressive. If he had refused to step outside, he would have been charged with obstruction. He did everything right. He remained calm, he was polite, he repeatedly offered proof, and yet the system still failed him catastrophically. The grim lesson here is that when someone in a position of power is determined to see you as a threat, your innocence can become irrelevant. Perhaps the only hypothetical that might have changed the outcome would be if his neighbor, Carol Peterson, had immediately walked outside and announced, "I know this man, he's the new owner." But a citizen shouldn't have to intervene to guarantee another's constitutional rights. The real what if lies with the institution. What if Officer Rourke had been empowered by her training and departmental culture to not just question, but to actively halt a wrongful arrest by a senior partner? What if the department's policies required a definitive confirmation that a crime has been committed before placing a compliant individual in handcuffs? The story shows that the most important changes aren't just about punishing bad officers, but about building systems of accountability and intervention that prevent these mistakes from happening in the first place. This isn't about one bad apple. It's about examining the health of the entire tree. The ultimate message is one of profound empathy and vigilance. It reminds us that behind every uniform is a human being susceptible to the same biases and flaws as anyone else. But their flaws carry the weight of the law and the power of life and death. And for those who find themselves in a situation like Julian's, it is a testament to the quiet strength it takes to endure the unthinkable, and to fight not just for personal compensation, but for systemic change, ensuring that your scars might somehow protect others from being wounded in the same way. What would you have done if you were in Julian's position? And what do you think is the single most important change police departments could make to prevent stories like this from happening? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below, and if this story resonated with you, please consider supporting the channel.